Greetings, my friend. How are you doing today? I hope you're fine, but if otherwise, I'm sorry to hear it. Truly. But hey, maybe we can change that, huh? I could try my best at it anyways. My friend, today I want to tell you a story. A story from a long time ago that took place worlds away from our home. Yet, I think by this story's end, you'll see that the people of this world are no different than you or I. The legendary realms, an entire world filled with a multitude of cultures and people spread across wild rolling mountains and seas. An endless arena purpose-built for the birth and nourishment of 1,000 and more adventures. Wars and quests, men and monsters, elves, and even dwarves live here. Whom, by the way, our story begins with. Far in the north, past the civilized lands, there lies a cold and desolate tundra, a place known as the Tired Blizzard. At one time, this frozen waste was home only to rime and hoarfrost. But just recently, a small group of dwarves has decided to call this icy expanse home. They were called Thunenothduk, the Living Moment. Sturdy and proud, they were far more used to lives lived underneath the sprawling southern mountains. But here they were, sent far from their homes and comfortable lives into a frosty, forbidding wilderness. They had no choice, for this was a quest given by the king himself, and they were to make an outpost for all of dwarven kind here at this place, Thunenratan. And so it was here they would strike the earth, and their lives would begin. The roaring winds clawed at skin and ripped at hair. It was like a fierce beast, hell-bent on stopping the dwarves, and it would have stopped the South's more delicate folk, but not the dwarves. In fact, they were in high spirits. The tundra was deadly and foreign, sure, but it was also strangely exciting. They could now live in any way they chose, as long as they put their hearts and souls into their work. 1,000 swirling possibilities clouded their minds. The wonders of the future, a magnificent home deep inside the rock below. Thunenratan would be a true jewel of the north. It was thoughts like these that livened their spirits, drove them forward, made life in the frozen north worth living. It wasn't until their first steps downwards that they encountered a problem. As they scraped away at the frozen soil, muddy water began to leak in from the surrounding sediment. Groundwater blocked passage downward. It was an aquifer, and it now lay between them and their grand designs. Just like that, their dreams were washed away. There would be no stone for their fortress, no mighty mountain halls, no endless tunnels carved through the flesh of the world. This was it, the dwarves and the frozen north. The wind would be their blanket, and the soil, their bed. It would have to do, and so given no other option, the dwarves set about scraping away the ice to collect the reddish clay from below. With it, they would make a new home. But it wasn't supposed to be like this. If only their quest could have been to the mountain slopes just a few kilometers to the south, or even the eastern forests, they could make a proper dwarven home. It just wasn't fair. The dwarves all lamented over their new dirt home, and so sadly, they worked through the cold days and freezing nights, collecting soil and making do. Days passed, weeks, months. All the while the dwarves kept at their task. Soon great walls of frozen clay had begun to rise from the featureless plain. The earthen walls weren't much to look at, but they were strong, frozen firm by the wind. Wind that would no longer reach the huddled dwarves. Beyond the walls, a moat was dug. It was a necessity. Without stone, traps would be impossible to make, and fine dwarven mechanisms made from soil would not do. The best they could hope for was to slow down incoming attackers. For food, the dwarves were able to farm inside small clay burrows underneath the fort. It was cool and dark, but mushrooms flourished there, giving them far more than they could want. But they did want. Without surface crops, there could be no carrots or corn, turnips or potatoes. Every meal was bland, and mushroom wine was starting to become quite stodgy. But, as with everything else in their fortress home so far, they had to learn to make do. As time went on, and the fortress continued to develop, migrants arrived. Southern dwarves, with grand ambitions of living in a magnificent dwarven citadel. Their dreams, too, were dashed. This was a fortress of frozen mud and a hellish icescape, not a proud home of legend. Soon, they too had to learn to relinquish their fanciful imaginings. This was their home now, and they would have to toil alongside their kin. Perhaps, given time and effort, one day this castle of dirt could be called adequate, at best. Time continued to trudge forward. Months changed to years, and all the while Thunenratan continued to rise. Crimson walls of heavy clay rose upwards from the snow. It stood as a bulwark against the cold and other unseen foes. Clustered along its top were the Dwarves Rooms. With scarcely any space in the fortress, they would have to reside here. Since they sat atop the walls, they could not be protected from the tundra's breath. Doors were a luxury they couldn't afford, so the tiny homes were all terribly drafty. The only amenities that could be found in each was a dwarf's own clothing, typically crafted from dog hide, as well as a single, small bed. Poor, forgotten souls were the dwarves of Thunenratan, victims of a cruel world and an uncaring king. This was their fortress, their prison, from which they could not escape. Under a gray blanket of wispy clouds, Thunenratan continued its growth. Life was hell, but it was becoming manageable. The burdens of tundra life had grown lighter over the years, though it didn't do much to stymie the griping of the dwarves. In their minds, it was a shame to have to get used to one's home. If things had just been different from the start, imagine how wondrous their home could be today. Hollow dreams from the minds of wistful dwarves. Dreams as fleeting and insubstantial as powdered snow. With the once looming fear of cold and hunger beginning to wane, a new emotion began to creep into its place. Boredom. No visitor had dared venture to the far-flung fortress since its creation, so news from the south was scarce. They were in a rut, the dwarves. They woke up, worked, and started it all over the next day. Theirs was a featureless, interminable existence unbroken by excitement or even modest joy. Thunenratan had become home to minds as gray as the clouds above. No dwarf could see a bright future built in the northern waste, and more than a few began to wonder if all the effort would ever be worth it. And that was life for those dwarves of the frozen north. An endless haze of gray and white, a haze that continued on for what felt like an eternity. It wasn't until that fateful storm came that things began to change. A screaming wind blew in from the west. It carried with it 1,000 tiny daggers of prickling ice. Shrieking and whipping, the gale seemed like some ancient titan in its death throes, though the dwarves well knew the raging storm was far from its end. Violent as it was, through it all, a muffled cry could be heard. It was faint, barely audible. Was it a voice? From the wall. "Traveler on the plain!" it called. "Moving quickly!" The figure was large. Was it wearing a cloak? The dwarves watched on eagerly at the hastening form. As it drew near, the eyes could be seen. Burning like hellfire, they cut through the snow's haze. Ambling quickly, the shadow was now near enough that the dwarves could make out the dark silhouette of a long whip-like tail. It trailed behind wildly, like a flag in high wind. "Were-lizard!" called the sentry. The fortress was under attack. Was this to be their end? Thunenratan was truly helpless against this threat. There were no gates, no guards, or even traps to defend the dwarves. The alarm was sounded, and the dwarves ran, gathering in the cold and dark of the meeting hall. It was the only option. Atop the high wall, sentries maintained their post. They watched on as the loping monster continued its charge, and strangely, seemed to slow. Previously unnoticed, more forms could now be seen. With fur as white as the snow, they trundled clumsily towards the fortress. The approaching shadow was chasing them. Through a sheet of white, the sentries continued to watch in terrified amusement as the first of the gray shapes entered the fortress. The black shadow followed swiftly behind, closing the shrinking gap. Black and gray met and united in deadly battle. Red burst from the shapes, spiraling outwards on the snow. Animalistic wailing joined the wind's frenzied howl, producing a hell's choir. The battle continued while the sentries watched. It seemed to go on for ages. But soon, the baleful discord quieted, and the twitching blob of gray and red ceased its struggle. It was still, pausing. Something broke away, a small form. It ran back out towards the open snowfields from whence it came. The attack was over. Yet the sentries were hesitant to call the all clear. The remaining gray masses who had escaped the werebeast's attack could now be seen. Tottering through the gates came a group of polar bear people, haggard and scared. The attack had clearly taken a toll on the beasts. From the safety of the meeting hall, the dwarves peered out at the creatures, who approached slowly, sniffing the air. These were the first visitors ever to come to the fortress. The dwarves were frightened, yet filled with excitement at the prospect of new faces in Thunenratan. The bears were just outside the hall when the first dwarf meekly poked its head out, smiling warmly. For a moment, dwarf and bear gazed at one another. An intrinsic understanding seemed to flow between these two denizens of the frozen north. But with the speed of a flying bolt, the change happened. Shaggy, muscular arms swung forward like great timbers, slamming into the dwarf. The moment was shattered. The dwarves were stunned. More of the enormous bear men were pushing through the door now. The creatures were raiders, not refugees. The dwarves reeled. So many questions. But the only choice that mattered at that moment was fight or die. And the dwarves did what dwarves do. They fought. In the days that followed, the fortress was a changed place. The battle against the bear folk was hard fought, and many dwarven lives were lost. But Thunenratan remained. The night of lizard and bear was a bloody, heartbreaking event that should have shattered the last thread of the dwarves' will. In a way, it did. As the dwarves went about the humbling task of cleaning spattered blood and burying their dead, they began to see things differently. It was a disorienting time of sadness and resolve. Many a dwarf had to look deep inside themselves to figure out what this life meant to them. With their silvery eyes frosted with icy tears, the dwarves, for the first time, saw the bleakness of their future and the folly of their past. They had begun to realize what fools they were. From the very beginning, Thunenratan was a work of desperation, a dwarven citadel of sod and soil built in an unforgiving tundra. A resourceful way to live, to be sure, but the dwarves despised their home of dirt. They had no choice. They were forced to remain in the north and given no resources, and so every day was spent bemoaning their hardships and grumbling at the wind. But they were now faced with questions. What would their future hold for them? Would it be wasted the same as the past? If so, would that be a life worthy of the name? Those who were lost in the attack never had a chance to ask these questions. It seemed a terrible shame now. The fallen ones lived miserable lives, spent in a place they despised. They never saw a change, and now were powerless to do anything. For the living, all the tiresome years wasted complaining amongst themselves seemed so insignificant in the face of this terrible reality. For the first time since the fortress's founding, the dwarves felt inspired. They looked upon the sodden walls with fresh eyes. Thunenratan was an enormous fortress, with wide ramparts and moats that would put many others to shame. With only the barest materials, they were able to construct a towering meeting hall, an impressive underground farm, and ingenious wall-top rooms for every single dwarf. But most impressive of all was that these feats were accomplished far from their home in a hostile, frozen wasteland. If Thunenratan could rise to these lofty heights while the dwarves were languishing in self-pity, just imagine what their lives could look like with a little pride. Now was the time for action. If they truly had no choice other than to stay, why not make Thunenratan a real fortress of legend? From that day on, the dwarves vowed to not let their home totter forward as a monument to pity, but instead, it would drive onward as a commanding symbol of dignity for all the world to see. And true to their word, the northern dwarves didn't stray from this plan. In time, it became their sole mission. Never again would they take this life for granted. Armed with meager resources and a dwarf's keen wisdom, they forged on, and over time molded Thunenratan into the mightiest stronghold the North had ever seen. It was just a shame that the dwarves who fell on that cold, snowy night wouldn't be there to see it. Well, my good bastards, there you have it. A tale of dirt, dwarves, and the far north. And somewhere within, a message. We are all equipped with a different set of tools in life. They take the form of our physical abilities, our upbringing, our mindset. Looking around, it could be very easy to think others are better suited to succeed than ourselves. This is untrue. We may all have different tools, but most of the time, all it takes is a little creativity to figure out the right way to use them. For some reason, it's often difficult to find the motivation to learn how to use one's unique skills, and sometimes it takes a trigger for us to see our tools for what they really are. That trigger can sometimes be confusing, jarring, or tragic, but it will always be eye-opening. I want you to look around. Look at what you've done. Your accomplishments may seem small, but it could very well be that you don't yet know how best to use your abilities. You can do it. Let this coming year be the one where you learn what your tools can do and how they can help build your dream. Warmest wishes, my brothers and sisters, and may luck be with you.